There's a man sitting in a house he worked 15 years to afford. The car in the driveway is the one he used to stare at on the drive home from his old job, the one he'd pass every night on his commute in a car with a check engine light he couldn't afford to fix, promising himself one day. The fridge is full. The bills are paid. Nobody is yelling at him. The phone isn't ringing with bad news. Nothing is wrong. And he feels nothing. Not sadness, exactly. Not even emptiness in the dramatic sense you see in movies, no collapsing to his knees, no dark night of the soul. Just static. A low hum underneath everything, present the second he stops moving, present in the quiet after the TV turns off, present at 4 in the morning when he wakes up for no reason and stares at a ceiling he technically owns. A low hum of "is this it?" He doesn't say this out loud. Men like him rarely do. He goes to work. He coaches his kids' team on Saturdays. He is by every visible metric fine. But something in him knows that fine is not the same as alive, and that gap between the two has been quietly widening for years, and he has no idea why, because he did everything right. He worked. He saved. He arrived. He's not alone in that living room, either, even if it looks like he is. A few miles away, a woman who spent a decade building a company from a laptop on her kitchen table just sold it for more money than her parents made in their entire working lives combined. She should be celebrating. Instead, she's sitting in a hotel room the night after the deal closed, phone off, curtains drawn, feeling a version of the exact same static. And on the other side of the country, a retired athlete who spent 20 years chasing a championship, who finally won it in his last season, who has the ring, the highlight reel, the parade. That man is sitting in his own kind of silence 6 months into retirement, wondering why winning the thing didn't do what he always assumed it would do. 3 different lives, 3 different forms of arrival, the exact same static underneath all of them. So let's ask the question underneath all of this, the one that should actually unsettle you. What if the thing you're chasing every single day, comfort, is slowly making you miserable? Not despite getting it, because you got it. That's not a metaphor. It's not a poetic flourish for a video script. It is, as far as psychology, neuroscience, philosophy, and the testimony of people who survive actual hell on earth can tell us, one of the most well-documented and least discussed facts about being human. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it in your own life. Here's the strange part. None of these 3 people are broken. Their brains aren't malfunctioning. They are working exactly, precisely, as designed. That's the horror of it. There's no villain to blame, no trauma to point to, no mistake any of them made along the way. They did everything the culture told them to do, and the culture's instructions were built on a lie about what actually satisfies a human nervous system. Psychologists have a name for what's happening to all 3 of them. It's called hedonic adaptation, sometimes called the hedonic treadmill, and it is one of the most replicated findings in the entire field of positive psychology. The core discovery is almost insulting in its simplicity. No matter what happens to you, good or bad, you drift back to roughly the same emotional baseline. This isn't a guess. In a landmark 1978 study, researchers Philip Brickman, Dan Coates, and Ronnie Janoff-Bullman studied 2 groups of people who represented the extremes of fortune, recent major lottery winners on one end, and people who had recently become paraplegic or quadriplegic in accidents on the other. The assumption going in, the assumption almost anyone would make, was that these 2 groups would land on wildly different points on the happiness scale and stay there. Instead, they found something far stranger. Within about a year, the lottery winners had drifted back to roughly their pre-win happiness levels. Even more strangely, the daily pleasures of ordinary life, a good meal, a joke with a friend, a pleasant morning, had actually become less enjoyable to the winners than before, dulled by comparison to the high of the win, in a phenomenon researchers would later term sensation ceiling. Meanwhile, the accident victims, after an initial and very real period of grief and adjustment, also drifted back toward their prior baseline far more than anyone expected, not all the way and not without real and lasting hardship, but enough to overturn the entire intuitive model of how life's circumstances map onto happiness. The mind, it turns out, is a thermostat, not a bucket. It doesn't fill up and stay full. It resets to a set point, the same way a thermostat doesn't get more heated the longer the furnace runs, it just holds a target temperature no matter what's happening outside. Your brain didn't evolve to make you happy. That sentence is worth sitting with because we assume the opposite our entire lives. We assume happiness is the goal our biology was built to deliver, the reward waiting at the end of enough effort. It isn't. Your brain evolved to keep you scanning for threats, scanning for resources, scanning for status within your tribe, scanning for anything that might kill you or help you survive long enough to reproduce and raise offspring who survive too. Contentment, from evolution's cold accounting, is a liability. A creature that feels fully satisfied stops scanning. A creature that stops scanning gets eaten by the thing hiding in the grass, or outcompeted for food, or replaced in the tribe's hierarchy by a rival who never stopped hungering. Evolution doesn't select for happy organisms. It selects for organisms that keep moving. So comfort registers in your nervous system not as a rival, but as safe for now, and safety is boring to a system built for threat detection. The moment you're safe, your brain does something almost sadistic. It resets the bar. The house the man in our opening scene saved 15 years for stops feeling like an achievement and starts feeling like the floor, the minimum, the thing that was always going to happen eventually if he just kept his head down. The raise he fought for in that performance review stops feeling like a reward within about 6 weeks. Researchers studying salary satisfaction have found the emotional boost from a raise typically fades within 1 to 3 months and starts feeling like rent, the baseline income required to maintain a lifestyle that itself just adjusted upward to meet it, with a slightly nicer car payment and a slightly larger mortgage absorbing the difference before he even notices it's gone. This is the treadmill, and the metaphor is exact. You're not standing still. You are working, striving, running as hard as you've ever run in your life. But the scenery never changes because the belt under your feet is moving at exactly the speed you are, calibrated in real time to whatever pace you set. There's a modern twist on this that makes it worse, not better. The comfort our ancestors were adapting away from was scarce and expensive to produce. Food took labor. Warmth took fuel, entertainment took community. Adaptation happened, but it happened at the speed of a life mostly spent working. Today, an entire industry exists whose sole purpose is engineering novelty faster than your brain can adapt to it, because a brain that adapts too quickly stops clicking, stops scrolling, stops opening the app. The variable reward schedule behind your phone's notifications, the same psychological mechanism, incidentally, that makes slot machines the most profitable devices in a casino, exists specifically to outrun your hedonic adaptation, to keep dangling a slightly different hit of stimulation in front of a nervous system that would otherwise have gone numb to it hours ago. You are not just adapting to comfort. You are being actively, deliberately kept 1/2 step ahead of full adaptation by systems built by people who have read the same research you're reading right now and used it against you for profit at scale. And here's the part that should actually unsettle you more than the treadmill itself. Comfort doesn't just fail to satisfy you. That would be bad enough on its own, a neutral disappointment, a broken promise from your own biology. But it's worse than neutral. Comfort actively atrophies the thing that could satisfy you. Every time you choose the path of least resistance, you are not just failing to grow, you are actively spending down a kind of capacity, like a muscle that weakens every day it isn't used, until eventually even small resistance feels unbearable. Psychologists have documented this in a specific pattern called experiential avoidance, the tendency, once discomfort has been avoided successfully a few times, to generalize that avoidance further and further, so that a person who once avoided one hard conversation starts avoiding all hard conversations. A person who once skipped one difficult workout starts finding reasons to skip all of them. A person who once numbed one bad feeling with a screen or a drink starts numbing every feeling that even resembles it. The man in that house isn't just failing to feel joy. He is, every day, becoming someone slightly less equipped to handle the discomfort that any real joy would require him to walk through first. This is not a new discovery. It only feels new because we forgot it, the same way every generation seems to have to rediscover gravity by falling. 2,300 years ago, a Stoic philosopher named Seneca, a man who, incidentally, was one of the wealthiest people in the Roman Empire, an advisor and tutor to an emperor, someone who had every comfort available to a human being in the ancient world at his fingertips, wrote a letter to his friend Lucilius that contains a line that should be carved somewhere you see it every morning. Nothing is so certain a sign of weakness as complaining. But it wasn't just a line. It was the tip of an entire philosophy of deliberate discomfort, one built over centuries by people who had every reason to want an easy life and deliberately chose not to have one. The Stoics were not monks retreating from the world to feel less. They were soldiers, statesmen, merchants, and, in the case of Epicurus, one of their most influential voices, a man who had literally been enslaved and beaten so severely as a young man that he walked with a permanent limp for the rest of his life, and who taught from that exact experience that discomfort was not the enemy of a good life. It was the material a good life was built from. Epicurus's central teaching, later distilled into what modern readers call the dichotomy of control, was brutally simple. Some things are up to you, your judgments, your responses, your choices, and some things are not, including your body, your reputation, your circumstances, even whether you'll be enslaved or free tomorrow. Suffering, he taught, comes not from events themselves, but from mistaking what's in the second category for something you can control. A man who has already accepted he might lose everything he owns tomorrow experiences today's small losses very differently than a man who has spent his whole life assuming comfort was owed to him. Marcus Aurelius, arguably the most powerful man on earth during his reign as Roman emperor, ruling over roughly a quarter of the world's population, wrote a private journal, never intended for publication, found among his effects after his death, that reads almost entirely as a man arguing himself out of comfort and back into duty. "You could leave life right now," he wrote to himself. "Let that determine what you do and say and think." Here was a man who could summon any luxury the ancient world had to offer with a single word, reminding himself daily that discomfort, difficulty, and mortality were not interruptions to be avoided but the actual raw conditions of being alive, conditions no amount of power could exempt him from, and that pretending otherwise was itself a kind of weakness. Seneca, despite his wealth, practiced something the Romans called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. Periodically, he would deliberately live like a poor man, eat the plainest food, wear the coarsest clothes, sleep on the hardest surface he could find, all while having a mansion and a fortune sitting untouched a few steps away. To modern ears raised on the gospel of self-care and treating yourself, this sounds borderline insane. Why would a man with everything voluntarily choose to have nothing, even briefly, when he could simply enjoy what he'd earned? Because Seneca understood something we've spent the last century trying very hard to forget: comfort, taken as a permanent state rather than an occasional rest, is a muscle relaxant for the soul. It doesn't heal you. It just stops you from noticing you're getting weaker. You cannot build resilience in a body that never carries weight, and you cannot build a self capable of withstanding difficulty if that self never touches any difficulty at all. The Stoics practiced discomfort the way an athlete practices lifting, not because pain is good in itself, but because the capacity built under controlled, chosen pain is the only thing standing between you and collapse when uncontrolled, and chosen pain eventually, inevitably, arrives. And it always arrives. No fortune, no security system, no amount of savings has ever successfully exempted a human life from loss, illness, betrayal, or death. The only real choice is whether you meet those things having practiced for them, or meet them for the very first time at the worst possible moment. There's a story, likely apocryphal but instructive regardless, told about Seneca's final days. When the Emperor Nero, his former student, ordered him to take his own life on suspicion of conspiracy, Seneca reportedly received the news with the same composure he'd spent decades writing about and practicing for. Whether every detail of that account is historically precise or embellished by later admirers almost doesn't matter. The point his students and readers took from it for 2,000 years afterward was that the entire philosophy had been a kind of rehearsal, and the final performance, when it came, looked exactly like the rehearsals had. Then, roughly 2,000 years after Seneca, a sickly, half-blind German philosopher living largely alone, racked by migraines and stomach ailments so severe they left him bedridden for days at a time, ailments that would eventually contribute to his complete mental collapse at the age of 44, took this same idea and sharpened it into something almost violent. Friedrich Nietzsche did not mean what doesn't kill you makes you stronger as the motivational poster line it has become, printed on gym walls next to inspirational sunsets. Strip away the merchandise, the gym bro tattoos, and the fitness influencer captions, and you find a much darker, much more specific diagnosis underneath. Nietzsche looked at the increasingly comfortable, increasingly secure society forming around him in 19th century Europe, a society with better medicine, better food, better security, and far less daily physical suffering than any in human history up to that point, and he did not see triumph. He saw something he found more frightening than suffering. He saw smallness. He gave this figure a name, the last man. In his book Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the last man is presented as the endpoint of a civilization that has optimized entirely for comfort and safety, the final form of a species that has solved all its heart problems and been left with nothing to push against. The last man has no great loves, no great hatreds, no great risks, no great questions. He works a little, so as not to tire himself. He has invented happiness, and blinks, satisfied with the invention, never noticing how small it is. He is content, sedated, and this is the detail Nietzsche wanted you to sit with longest, secretly ashamed of it, in the rare moments he's honest with himself, in the moments right before sleep when the static creeps in and he has to reach for something to drown it out. The last man is not a villain. He is not cruel or evil. He is simply small, by choice, generation after generation, because smallness was easier than the alternative, and nobody around him seemed to be reaching for anything higher either, so why should he? Nietzsche's answer to this wasn't go seek out pain for its own sake. That's a cartoon version of his philosophy that misses the actual argument entirely, and it's worth being precise here because the caricature has done real damage to how people apply this idea. His real point was stop running from the resistance that makes you into someone. Difficulty, for Nietzsche, isn't an obstacle standing between you and the meaningful life. It is the meaningful life, or at least the raw material from which one is built. A self that has never been tested against anything hard is not a self at all yet. It's a placeholder, a rough draft, a sketch waiting for the pressure that would turn it into a finished thing. He wrote of amor fati, the love of one's fate, including its hardships, not as passive resignation but as an active embrace, a decision to want the difficulty precisely because it was the forge, not the flame that threatened to destroy what was already there. He went further into an idea so demanding almost no reader takes it entirely literally, the thought experiment of eternal recurrence, the challenge of imagining that you would have to live this exact life, with every hardship, every disappointment, every moment of static and doubt, over and over again for eternity, unchanged, forever. Could you want that? Could you affirm it? Nietzsche's point wasn't that this was literally true cosmologically. His point was that the question itself is a diagnostic tool. A life built entirely around minimizing discomfort, a life spent flinching away from every hard thing, is a life that fails this test instantly. You would never choose to relive an existence built on flinching. But a life built around meeting difficulty, around the deliberate cultivation of strength through resistance, is a life you might actually be able to say yes to, difficulties and all, because the difficulties were never separate from the meaning. They were the mechanism of it. All of this, Seneca's deliberate hardship, Marcus Aurelius's private discipline, Nietzsche's warning about the last man, could be dismissed as philosophy for people who've never actually suffered. Easy to praise hardship from a Roman villa. Easy to warn against comfort from a desk in Basel, surrounded by books, never having missed a meal in your life. So let's take the theory and test it against the worst laboratory a human being has ever been forced to endure, a place with no philosophy left in it at all, just cold, hunger, and the daily, ordinary presence of death. Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist in Vienna before the Nazis came for his family. He had built a career studying the human mind, developing his own approach to psychotherapy that he called logotherapy, built around the idea that the primary drive in human beings isn't pleasure, as Freud had argued, and isn't power, as Adler had argued, but meaning. He had a wife, parents, patients, a manuscript he had been writing for years that represented the culmination of that work, and this detail matters, an offer of a visa to escape to America obtained before the worst of the deportations began, which he ultimately turned down because he couldn't bring himself to abandon his aging parents to whatever was coming. Then, in a matter of months, every single comfort a human being can have was stripped from him with a completeness that's almost impossible to comprehend from the outside, looking in from a comfortable chair reading about it decades later. His wife, his parents, his work, his home, the manuscript he'd hidden in the lining of his coat and which was confiscated and destroyed within his first hours at the camp, the clothes off his back, his name replaced with a number tattooed into his arm. He was sent to Auschwitz and later to other camps including Dachau, and he watched people around him die of starvation, of disease, of violence, and of something the guards and prisoners alike came to recognize as a specific, observable phenomenon. A prisoner would one day announce they knew the exact date they would die, stop eating, stop moving, sometimes start smoking cigarettes they'd been hoarding as currency, a clear signal of surrender, since a cigarette smoked meant no more bargaining left to do, and be dead within days, as if the mind itself had reached a decision and simply switched off the body's will to continue. By every model of happiness built on comfort and hedonic adaptation, Frankl should have had nothing left to hold on to. There was no baseline of comfort to drift back toward. There was no treadmill to run on, because there was no ground under his feet at all. The entire structure that hedonic adaptation depends on, a life with enough stability to even have a baseline in the first place, had been annihilated in a matter of weeks. And yet, in that camp, surrounded by more suffering than most humans will ever witness in 100 lifetimes, Frankl made an observation that would outlive the war, outlive him, and become one of the most influential ideas in 20th century psychology. He noticed that the prisoners who survived, not just physically, because physical survival was mostly luck, timing, and circumstance beyond anyone's control, but survived psychologically, kept some thread of a coherent self intact through the process rather than dissolving into the numbness that claimed so many, were not the ones who had come from the easiest lives before the camps. Wealth, status, prior physical strength, and prior comfort predicted almost nothing about who held together and who dissolved. What predicted it, again and again, in case after case Frankl documented, was whether a person had found something to orient toward even inside the horror. A specific person waiting for them on the outside, real or imagined. A piece of work left unfinished, a book half written, a manuscript hidden and hoped for even after the original had been destroyed. A meaning that had not yet been extracted from their life, even while everything else, every possession, every relationship, every physical comfort had been extracted by force. Frankl describes in his own account surviving one of the camp's most brutal stretches of forced labor by mentally reconstructing, detail by detail, a lecture he intended to give someday after the war about the psychology of concentration camp inmates, using the very suffering he was enduring in that moment as the future material of a purpose he hadn't lost, turning present agony into an act of note-taking for a future self he was determined would exist. He describes another prisoner who survived by picturing, in obsessive and comforting detail, a conversation with his wife, believing, correctly as it turned out, that she was somewhere alive, and that this belief alone was worth enduring almost anything to protect. Frankl would later write that even in that place, stripped of every last external good, one freedom remained that could not be confiscated, the freedom to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. His conclusion, laid out later in his book Man's Search for Meaning, a book he wrote in 9 days after the war, almost as if the words had been queued up inside him for years, waiting for the chance to get out, a book that has since sold more than 16 million copies and been named by the Library of Congress as one of the 10 most influential books in America, was this: it is not the presence of suffering, and it is not the presence of comfort, that determines the quality of a life. What determines it is what you find, or fail to find, worth suffering for. Read that again, because it's easy to skim past a sentence that dense. Frankl is not glorifying suffering. He is not telling you Auschwitz was good for him, or that pain is inherently noble, or that you should go looking for hardship as an end in itself. He was explicit, repeatedly, that unnecessary suffering was still simply bad, still simply something to be reduced wherever reduction was possible. He watched suffering destroy people thoroughly and permanently, and he never once pretended otherwise. What he's telling you is something more precise, and in a way more useful, than either suffering is good or suffering is bad. Comfort was never the variable that mattered in the first place. It never determined who broke and who held, in the camps or, by extension, anywhere else. The variable that mattered was meaning, whether a person had something outside their own immediate physical state that their endurance could be in service of. Comfort, in the absence of that, protects nothing, as the countless comfortable, secure prisoners who had lived easy lives before the war and still dissolved inside the camps made clear. And meaning, in the presence of real deprivation, can carry a person through conditions that should, by any reasonable measure, have been entirely unsurvivable. Step back from the extremes for a moment, from Auschwitz, from the Roman Senate, from Basel, and look at what this same pattern does at the ordinary, unremarkable scale most of us actually live at. Consider the retired athlete from the opening of this script. For 20 years his life had a structure almost nobody else's life has, a clear goal, an external measure of progress, a season that ended and forced a reckoning, and a body that had to be pushed against real resistance every single day just to stay competitive. Every one of those years was, in its own way, uncomfortable. Early mornings, injuries played through, a diet dictated by performance rather than pleasure, a life almost entirely organized around a single difficult pursuit. And by his own account, given years later in an interview after he'd found his footing again, those were also, somehow, some of the most alive years of his life, even the painful ones, even the losing seasons. Then he won the championship, and within a year of retiring he found himself in a life with no forced resistance left in it at all, no season, no opponent, no early alarm demanding a body he'd have to fight to get out of bed and into. He had all the money he needed and all the time in the world to spend it on comfort. And he describes, in that same interview, a period of roughly 18 months where he felt more lost than at any previous point in his career, including the injuries, including the losing seasons, including the years before anyone thought he'd make it at all. Comfort, once it was total and unearned by daily resistance, didn't feel like the reward the previous 20 years had promised him it would be. It felt like the floor falling out. He eventually found his way back, not notably by acquiring more comfort, but by manufacturing difficulty deliberately where the sport no longer supplied it for free. He started a foundation that put him in rooms with genuinely hard problems he had no existing skill to solve, forcing him to be a beginner again in public at an age and level of fame where beginner status is deeply uncomfortable to occupy. He started training for an entirely different, much less glamorous athletic challenge with real risk of public failure attached to it. In interviews, he's been direct that this wasn't about chasing a new high, it was about recreating the one condition that had made the previous 20 years feel alive, real resistance, chosen deliberately, with a real chance of failing. Consider, too, the tech entrepreneur 6 months after her exit. Her static resolve, eventually, but not through any of the things money could buy, not a vacation, not a bigger house, not a nicer car, all of which she tried in sequence in the months right after the sale, each one delivering a spike of pleasure that dissolved within days, exactly as hedonic adaptation predicts it would. What actually shifted things was a decision to start a second company from nothing, with a fraction of the resources she'd started the first one with, on a problem hard enough that she genuinely didn't know if she could solve it. Friends who'd watched her sell the first company for an enormous sum found this baffling. Why go back into the fire when you never have to again? Her answer, paraphrased from a conversation about the decision, was close to Frankl's insight. Even though she'd never read him, the money had removed every excuse for discomfort, and removing every excuse for discomfort had somehow made her feel worse, not better, because comfort with no resistance attached to it had turned out to have nothing underneath it to hold on to. None of this means money, success, or ease are bad, or that anyone should feel guilty for wanting them, or that suffering should be pursued as a lifestyle brand. That would be exactly the cartoon version of this idea that both Nietzsche and Frankl explicitly warned against. What it means is narrower and more useful than that. Comfort, once achieved, does not on its own supply the thing a human nervous system actually needs in order to feel alive. It removes obstacles. It does not, by itself, supply meaning, resistance, or growth, and without those three things running underneath it, comfort curdles into exactly the static the man in the opening scene is sitting in right now, in a house he worked 15 years to afford, wondering why arriving feels so much like nowhere at all. So here's the paradox, laid out plainly, built from a Roman letter, a private emperor's journal, a German warning, a psychiatrist's testimony from the worst place on earth, and two ordinary modern lives that happen to test the theory without meaning to. The more you optimize your life for zero friction, the less capable you become of tolerating any friction at all. This isn't a moral failing, it's closer to a physical law, the same way a muscle that never bears load gets weaker, not stronger, from disuse, the same way an astronaut's bones lose density in zero gravity even while he feels perfectly fine the entire time, right up until he tries to stand under real weight again and discovers what's already been quietly lost. And the less capable you are of tolerating friction, the smaller your life has to become in order to stay comfortable, because more and more situations start registering as unbearable that used to register as merely inconvenient. A hard conversation starts feeling like a crisis rather than an afternoon's discomfort. A minor professional setback starts feeling catastrophic rather than routine. The radius of what you're willing to attempt keeps shrinking quietly, one avoided discomfort at a time, until one day you look up and realize the life you built specifically to feel safe has become a life that barely feels like anything at all. It's a spiral with a shrinking radius, and the terrifying thing about it is how good it feels at every individual step along the way down. Nobody chooses the spiral on purpose. They just keep choosing comfort, one decision at a time, in ways that feel entirely reasonable in the moment, and the spiral is what all those reasonable decisions add up to. Comfort feels, in the moment, like the reward you've been working toward your whole life. It is actually the sedative. It doesn't just fail to build you, it quietly, invisibly disassembles the parts of you that were built for anything harder, exactly the way disuse disassembles muscle and bone, without ever announcing that it's happening until the day you actually need the strength and discover it isn't there anymore. Meanwhile, the version of you that could actually feel something proud, alive, used for something larger than your own convenience, only gets built the exact way Seneca trained it 2,000 years ago, under load. Not under punishment. Not under senseless suffering pursued for its own sake, which both the Stoics and Frankl explicitly rejected as pointless. Under load, deliberately chosen where possible, honestly faced where it isn't a choice at all, and repeatedly endured until endurance becomes a kind of second nature. It's worth pausing on why the brain works this way at the level of actual biology, because the mechanism turns out to be even stranger than the behavior it produces. For decades, the popular science explanation for all of this has been dopamine, delivered as a kind of catch-all villain. Dopamine is the pleasure chemical, comfort floods you with it, and then you need more of it to feel the same effect, exactly like a drug. That story isn't quite wrong, but it isn't quite right either, and the actual research is more useful than the simplified version. The neuroscientist Kent Berridge, working at the University of Michigan, spent years running an elegant set of experiments on rats that overturned the simple dopamine equals pleasure model. Berridge and his colleagues found that dopamine isn't actually the chemical of pleasure at all, it's the chemical of wanting. There's a separate system in the brain, running on opioids rather than dopamine, that produces liking, the actual in-the-moment enjoyment of a reward once you've got it. Wanting and liking, it turns out, are two different circuits, and they can be pulled apart from each other in ways that explain an enormous amount of human misery. In Berridge's rats, you could damage the dopamine system entirely and the animal would still show every sign of liking a sweet treat placed on its tongue, the same facial reactions, the same behavioral markers of enjoyment researchers used to measure pleasure in animals unable to describe it themselves. What the rat lost wasn't the capacity to enjoy the treat. It was the drive to go get one in the first place. Conversely, you could stimulate the dopamine system directly and produce an animal absolutely frantic with wanting, pressing a lever obsessively, prioritizing the reward over food, over rest, over everything, without any corresponding increase in how much it actually enjoyed the thing once it got there. This is the mechanism hiding underneath the man in that house. His dopamine system, the wanting system, worked exactly as it was supposed to. For 15 years. It kept him scanning, striving, pressing the lever, chasing the house and the car and the promotion, because wanting is what dopamine is built to produce relentlessly, regardless of what's actually waiting at the end of the chase. But once he arrived, the liking system, the opioid system, the one responsible for the actual, felt enjoyment of what he'd built, never got the memo that it was supposed to switch on and stay on. Liking, it turns out, is far more fragile and far more easily exhausted than wanting. Wanting can run almost indefinitely, is largely indifferent to whether the goal actually delivers satisfaction, and this is the cruel part, is actually most active during the pursuit of a reward, not the possession of it. Which means the 15 years spent chasing the house may well have contained more of what his brain was built to produce than the arrival ever could. This maps almost exactly onto addiction research, and it's not a coincidence. Berridge's later work on addiction found that repeated exposure to a rewarding substance or behavior can cause wanting to increase even as liking decreases, a phenomenon he termed incentive sensitization. An addict, months or years into a habit, frequently reports getting less and less pleasure from the substance while feeling an ever more desperate compulsion to seek it out. The wanting circuit gets more sensitive with repetition. The liking circuit gets less sensitive with repetition. The gap between them is where the suffering lies. You do not need a substance for this pattern to apply to you. Any pursuit, money, status, a physique, a relationship milestone, a follow count can produce the exact same split. You can find yourself wanting something with the same white-knuckle urgency you'd expect from genuine desire, while the liking, the actual felt satisfaction on delivery, quietly shrinks with every repetition, until you're pressing the lever purely out of habit, chasing a hit that stopped delivering anything years ago and you never noticed the exact day it happened. This is also, not incidentally, the exact mechanism the entire comfort and convenience industry has learned to exploit with staggering precision. A feed that refreshes with unpredictable content is not accidentally addictive, it is engineered around exactly this wanting/liking gap, engineered to keep the wanting circuit firing on a schedule deliberately designed to outrun the liking circuit's ability to adapt and go quiet. You are not weak for finding it compelling. You are biologically exactly the animal Berridge's research describes, being deliberately targeted by systems built by people who understand your own nervous system better than you do. There's a philosopher almost always cited as the ancient world's champion of comfort and pleasure, and almost always cited wrongly, in a way that's actually instructive once corrected. Epicurus, founder of a school of philosophy in Athens around 300 BC, has come down through history with a reputation. Epicurean is still a synonym in modern English for indulgent, luxurious pleasure-seeking that would have baffled the actual man and his actual followers. Epicurus did teach that pleasure was the highest good. But when you look at what he actually meant by pleasure and how he and his students actually live, the picture inverts almost completely from the popular caricature. Epicurus lived by choice an extremely simple life. He and his followers ate mostly bread and water, considering cheese an occasional luxury. He explicitly warned against exactly the kind of hedonic chasing this script have been describing, writing that unlimited pleasure-seeking led not to satisfaction but to a kind of endless, anxious craving. He had, in effect, identified hedonic adaptation and the wanting/liking gap roughly 2,000 years before Brickman or Berridge ran a single experiment. His actual recommendation was to reduce desires to the point where they could be reliably and simply satisfied, rather than chasing ever larger pleasures that would only reset the baseline and demand more. A version of a line reliably attributed to him holds that abundance comes not from what a person has but from what they can actually enjoy, which reads less like an invitation to indulgence and more like an early, precise diagnosis of exactly the trap the man in that house has fallen into. Compare this to a rival school. Epicurus explicitly argued against the Cyrenaics, followers of Aristippus, who taught that intense, immediate physical pleasure was the highest good and should be pursued directly and without much restraint, since the future was uncertain and the present sensation was all that could really be counted on. It's worth noticing that the Cyrenaic position, pursue the biggest, most intense hit of pleasure available right now, is essentially the operating philosophy most modern comfort-driven lives run on by default, even though almost nobody has heard of the Cyrenaics, and Epicurus's actual, far more disciplined philosophy is the one whose name got attached, ironically, to the opposite behavior. The lesson buried in this historical mix-up is worth sitting with. Even the ancient philosopher whose entire brand was pleasure concluded, after serious thought, that the path to pleasure ran through restraint, simplicity, and the deliberate avoidance of the very comfort chasing his name has since become a synonym for. If the philosopher of pleasure himself landed on restraint as the mechanism, that should tell you something about how reliable the direct comfort-first route actually is. Frankl's observations from the camps have since been picked up and formalized by modern psychology in ways that go well beyond his original testimony, and the research is worth including here because it answers an obvious objection. Maybe Frankl was simply an unusually resilient individual, a statistical outlier whose experience doesn't generalize. In the 1990s, psychologists Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Callahan began studying survivors of a wide range of traumatic events: combat veterans, cancer survivors, people who had lost children, survivors of natural disasters, and identified a consistent pattern they named post-traumatic growth. The finding that a significant proportion of people who go through severe adversity report afterward not just recovery back to their prior baseline, but genuine positive psychological change that exceeds it. Increased appreciation for life, deeper relationships, a greater sense of personal strength, a clearer sense of priorities, spiritual or existential development. This isn't a denial of the very real damage trauma can and does cause. Tedeschi and Callahan were careful to distinguish growth from an absence of suffering, noting that the growth often occurs precisely because of the struggle to cope with the event, not instead of it, and frequently coexists with ongoing distress rather than replacing it. What the research consistently identifies as the differentiating factor between people who experience this growth and people who don't tracks remarkably closely with what Frankl observed in the camps decades earlier: whether the person is able to construct some kind of meaning or narrative purpose from the difficulty, rather than experiencing it as pure, meaningless damage. Combat veterans who found ways to frame their service as protecting people they loved showed different outcomes than those who couldn't locate any purpose in what they'd been through. Cancer survivors who used the diagnosis as a catalyst to reorganize their priorities around what actually mattered to them showed different outcomes than those who experienced it purely as random, senseless misfortune. None of this is an argument for seeking out trauma any more than Frankl's testimony was an argument for seeking out concentration camps. Real, severe adversity remains something to be prevented and treated wherever possible, and plenty of people who go through it experience only damage, with no growth to offset it. Post-traumatic growth is a documented phenomenon, not a guaranteed or automatic one. But the research does answer the objection about Frankl being a statistical fluke. The pattern he identified in the most extreme circumstances imaginable shows up reliably at smaller scale across an enormous range of ordinary human hardship, which suggests it's tapping into something structural about how human psychology actually works, rather than something unique to one unusually resilient man. There's a related body of research that approaches the same territory from an entirely different angle, and it belongs here because it explains something the earlier sections leave hanging. If difficulty is what builds the capacity for satisfaction, why does difficulty so often just feel like difficulty, rather than anything good? The psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi spent decades studying a mental state he named flow. The experience, reported with remarkable consistency across painters, rock climbers, surgeons, chess players, and assembly line workers alike, of being so fully absorbed in a challenging activity that self-consciousness disappears, time distorts, and the activity becomes its own reward, needing no external justification at all. Csikszentmihalyi's research identified the precise condition under which flow reliably occurs, and it's not the condition most people would guess. Flow does not occur when a task is easy. It does not occur when a task is comfortable. It occurs in a narrow band where the challenge of the task closely matches and slightly stretches the skill of the person attempting it, difficult enough to demand full attention, not so difficult that it produces anxiety and shutdown instead of absorption. Too little challenge relative to skill, and the result is boredom, the exact static the man in that house had been sitting in a life that has systematically eliminated every source of real challenge from around him. Too much challenge relative to skill, and the result is anxiety, the shutdown response that makes people avoid a task altogether. But in the narrow, demanding, uncomfortable middle, where the task is genuinely hard, genuinely uncertain in outcome, and genuinely requires the person's full capacity to meet it, Csikszentmihalyi's research consistently found the single most reliably reported state of deep, sustained satisfaction available to human beings. Not comfort, not ease. Structured, chosen difficulty, calibrated just past what feels safe. This is, in effect, a modern laboratory confirmation of exactly what Seneca was practicing with cold floors and plain food, what Nietzsche was diagnosing in The Last Man's absence of any real challenge, and what Frankl found the survivors of the camps orienting toward even in conditions of total deprivation. The nervous system does not appear to be built to reward the absence of difficulty. It appears to be built to reward difficulty successfully met, which means a life engineered for maximum ease isn't just failing to add satisfaction on top of an otherwise fine baseline. It's actively removing the only conditions under which the deepest, most reliably reported form of human satisfaction has ever been shown to occur. Go back, for a moment, to the three people this script opened with, and add a fourth, because the pattern is easier to trust once you've seen it survive contact with more than one kind of life. There's a soldier, a combat medic 3 tours behind her, who describes, in an oral history collected years after her service, the strange, guilty truth that the worst period of her adult life wasn't any of the deployments, even the ones with real danger and real loss in them, but the 18 months immediately after leaving the service, sitting in a comfortable apartment with a steady paycheck and nothing that needed her at 3 in the morning. She describes searching, almost frantically, for something, anything, that would require the same total presence her old work had demanded of her by default, and eventually finding it in emergency room nursing, a career she describes not as safer or easier than combat medicine, but as the closest available substitute for the one condition her nervous system seemed unable to function well without, real stakes, attended to under real pressure in service of someone other than herself. There's an artist, a sculptor, who spent decades working in poverty before an unexpected gallery success finally gave him financial security in his 60s. In an interview given a few years into that security, he describes a period where he simply couldn't make anything. The work that had once poured out of him under the pressure of rent due and materials ration suddenly went quiet the moment the pressure disappeared, and he had to deliberately, artificially reintroduce constraint into his process, giving himself absurdly small budgets and impossible deadlines on projects nobody was forcing him to complete, purely because he'd discovered that removing all resistance had removed the thing that made the work happen at all. There's a monk at a monastery that still practices a rule of manual labor alongside prayer, who was asked by a visiting researcher studying vocations why an order with substantial financial endowment, more than sufficient to hire outside labor for the physical work of maintaining the grounds, still requires its members to do that labor themselves by hand every day, in addition to a life already organized around considerable discipline and restraint. His answer, paraphrased, was that the labor wasn't there because the monastery needed the work done. It was there because the monks needed the resistance, and a life with prayer and contemplation but no physical difficulty in it had, in earlier eras of the order's history, reliably produced monks who reported the exact same static. The man in the opening scene of this script is sitting with a comfort so total it curdled into something closer to despair than peace. 4 rooms. A suburban house, a hotel room after a life-changing sale, an apartment after a military career, a monastery with more money than it needs. 4 completely different economic, cultural, and spiritual contexts. The same underlying mechanism showing up in every single one, because the mechanism isn't really about money or war or art or God. It's about what a human nervous system does reliably when resistance disappears, and what it does just as reliably when resistance is deliberately, sanely reintroduced. None of this is useful as pure diagnosis. A person who finishes this script simply more aware that comfort is a trap, with no change in behavior to follow, has gained nothing but a slightly more articulate version of the same static. So it's worth being concrete about what actually reintroducing resistance looks like, because seek discomfort on its own is close to useless as advice. The discomfort has to be structured correctly, or it just produces damage instead of growth, exactly the way C6 and Minalee's research found that too much challenge relative to skill produces anxiety rather than flow. The first and most basic move, the one underneath everything else, is choosing a goal with a real chance of failure attached to it, rather than a goal you already know, quietly, you're going to hit. This is uncomfortable to even write down because most goal-setting advice in the comfort-optimized culture pushes in the opposite direction. Make your goals achievable, set yourself up for wins, build confidence through easy successes. That advice isn't wrong for a beginner building basic competence. But for the man in that house, who has already built competence, already built security, already built comfort, more easy wins produce nothing but more of the exact static he's sitting in. What he needs isn't another guaranteed win. It's a goal uncomfortable enough that he genuinely doesn't know, going in, whether he'll succeed, a business he might fail at, a physical challenge he might not complete, a creative project he might never finish to his own satisfaction. Real stakes. Real risk of the specific, honest kind Marcus Aurelius reminded himself of every morning. The second move is orienting existing effort towards something outside the self, the specific move Frankl identified as differentiating survival from collapse in the camps, and which shows up just as reliably at ordinary scale. A discipline pursued purely for personal optimization, a workout regimen justified only by wanting a better body, a savings plan justified only by wanting a bigger number in an account tends to run out of fuel roughly on schedule with hedonic adaptation because the self that benefits from it is the same self doing the adapting. A discipline connected to someone or something outside that loop, training for a physical challenge in honor of someone, building a business that solves a real problem for real people, maintaining a skill in order to eventually teach it, draws on a different, apparently more durable source of motivation, one less subject to the treadmill because the reward isn't routed back through the same nervous system that keeps resetting its own baseline. The third move is deliberately, periodically removing an accustomed comfort in the specific tradition of Seneca's premeditatio malorum, not as punishment but as calibration, a reminder delivered to the nervous system directly rather than through argument, that the comforts currently taken for granted are not, in fact, the floor of existence but an achieved and temporary state that could be lost and is worth noticing rather than numbing out. This doesn't require anything extreme. It can be as simple as a period of deliberately simple living, a stretch of time without a convenience normally relied on, a physical challenge undertaken specifically because it's hard rather than because it's enjoyable. The goal isn't suffering for its own sake. The goal is recalibrating a baseline that has quietly drifted upward without permission, the same way stepping away from a loud room lets you notice, on return, exactly how loud it actually was. The fourth move, and probably the hardest to actually practice, is treating the discomfort of a hard conversation, a risky decision, or a demanding commitment as information rather than as a signal to retreat. The nervous system, doing exactly what it evolved to do, will flag almost any of these things as danger, will produce the same physiological alarm bells for difficult performance review that it would have produced for a genuine ancestral threat. The Stoic move practiced daily by Epicurus' students is not to ignore that alarm but to interrogate it. Is this actually dangerous in the sense of threatening survival, or is it merely uncomfortable in the sense of requiring effort and risking a bruised ego? Most of the discomforts a modern comfortable life is arranged to avoid are the second kind, not the first, and the alarm bell doesn't reliably distinguish between them on its own. Distinguishing between them is a skill practiced daily by people willing to feel the alarm and act anyway, and it atrophies exactly as fast as any other muscle left unused. It's worth remembering because it's easy to forget that the entire premise of this script, a life so comfortable that comfort itself becomes the problem, is a genuinely new situation for human beings to find themselves in, historically speaking. For the overwhelming majority of the roughly 300,000 years modern humans have existed, comfort in anything like the modern sense was not an available failure mode because comfort in anything like the modern sense simply did not exist. Food was uncertain. Shelter was fragile. Winters killed people. A single bad harvest could end a village. Disease moved through a population with nothing to check it. For nearly all of human history, the problem was never too much comfort. The problem was survival, full stop, every single day, for essentially the entire species. This changes remarkably recently and remarkably fast. The Industrial Revolution, beginning in the late 1700s, started a process that compressed thousands of years of gradual improvement in material conditions into a couple of centuries. Indoor plumbing, once a luxury reserved for palaces, became ordinary. Central heating turned winter from a genuine seasonal threat into a mild inconvenience solved by a thermostat. Refrigeration ended the annual anxiety of whether stored food would last. Antibiotics turned infections that had killed for all of recorded history into a week of mild inconvenience and a course of pills. By almost any measure available to historians and economists, a person living at an ordinary, unremarkable income level in a developed country today has access to more physical safety, more consistent food, more medical care, and more climate control than kings and emperors had access to a few centuries ago. This is by any reasonable measure a genuine triumph, and nothing in this script should be read as an argument against it. Nobody serious is suggesting a return to routine famine, curable diseases left untreated, or homes with no heat in the name of building character. The Stoics practiced discomfort deliberately and briefly precisely because they lived in a world where genuine, involuntary discomfort was always close at hand regardless. The practice was calibration against an ever-present backdrop, not a replacement for a world that had eliminated hardship entirely. What's different now, for the first time in the species' history, is that an ordinary person can, if they choose to, structure an entire life with almost no involuntary discomfort in it at all, work from a couch, food delivered without leaving the building, entertainment without end, medical anxieties mostly resolved with a same-day appointment. The genuine triumph of eliminating unnecessary suffering has, as an unplanned side effect nobody was optimizing for, also eliminated most of the necessary difficulty as human nervous system apparently needs some ongoing exposure to in order to feel anything at all. This is a new kind of problem, and it's worth naming as new because it means none of the old wisdom traditions were built with quite this scenario in mind. Seneca never had to worry about a member of his household living an entire adult life with zero physical exertion, zero financial uncertainty, and zero unmet material need. That specific configuration, total comfort, sustained indefinitely, chosen rather than forced, is close to unprecedented in the historical record, which is exactly why the man in that house has no cultural script for what he's experiencing. His grandparents had a depression and a world war to organize their sense of meaning around, whether they wanted that organizing principle or not. He has central air conditioning and a subscription streaming service, and nothing forcing him toward anything at all. There's a specific, well-documented strand of psychological research that speaks directly to what happens when a person actually gets the comfort they've been pursuing, and it's worth including here because it moves the argument from philosophy and neuroscience into straightforward, replicated survey data. The psychologist Tim Kasser spent much of his career studying what he termed materialistic value orientation, the degree to which a person organizes their life around the pursuit of wealth, possessions, image, and status relative to other possible values like relationships, personal growth, or community. Across a large body of studies conducted over decades, Kasser and his collaborators found a consistent, replicated pattern. People who score higher on measures of materialistic orientation report, on average, lower life satisfaction, more depression and anxiety, poorer relationship quality, and even, in some studies, worse physical health markers than people who score lower, holding actual income roughly constant. This isn't simply poor people are less materialistic and also less happy for unrelated reasons. The effect shows up within income brackets, comparing people at similar levels of actual wealth who differ in how central acquiring more of it is to their sense of identity and daily motivation. Separately, the psychologists Leif van Boven and Thomas Jalovic ran a series of studies comparing satisfaction derived from material purchases against satisfaction derived from experiential ones, a vacation versus a television, a concert versus a piece of furniture, and found a consistent asymmetry. Material purchases were more prone to exactly the hedonic adaptation described earlier in this script. The new television is exciting for a few weeks and then simply becomes part of the furniture, invisible, absorbed into the baseline. Experiences, by contrast, showed markedly more resistance to this fading, in part because experiences resist direct comparison in the way possessions don't. It's easy to notice a neighbor's new car sitting in their driveway and feel your own comparatively diminished, but far harder to make a similarly deflating comparison against a memory. Experiences also become part of a person's ongoing identity and story in a way objects generally don't. People don't usually introduce themselves by describing their furniture, but they do describe the trip they took, the challenge they completed, the thing they built. Taken together, this research draws a fairly direct line back to everything the Stoics, Nietzsche, and Frankl were arguing from entirely different starting points. The things that reliably resist hedonic adaptation, meaningful challenge, connection to something outside the self, an ongoing story rather than a static possession, are exactly the things a life optimized purely for comfort and acquisition tends to squeeze out first, because they are precisely the things that require friction, uncertainty, and effort to obtain, which a comfort-optimized life is by definition built to minimize. The four moves outlined earlier, real-risk goals, other-oriented effort, deliberate periodic simplicity, and treating discomfort as information rather than danger, are foundational, but there are a few further, more specific practices worth adding, drawn from the same research and traditions this script has already covered. One is the deliberate cultivation of a skill with a visible ceiling far above your current level, chosen specifically because the gap between where you are and where the skill's true ceiling sits guarantees years of exactly the kind of challenge matched to growing skill conditions C6 and Mihaly's flow research identifies as most reliably satisfying. A hobby picked up casually, practiced only when convenient, rarely produces this because convenience and flow pull in opposite directions. Flow requires a stretch, and stretch is definitionally not convenient. This is part of why so many people report their most alive, most satisfying stretches of adult life connected to the early, difficult years of learning something, a language, an instrument, a craft, rather than to the comfortable plateau of having already mastered it. Another is what might be called voluntary constraint in an area of existing abundance, the sculptor's small budgets and impossible deadlines imposed on himself specifically because his actual resources no longer imposed any. This differs from Seneca's periodic hardship in that it's ongoing rather than occasional, built into the regular practice of a skill or discipline rather than reserved for deliberate calibration exercises. A writer with no financial pressure at all can still set an artificial word count and deadline. A businessperson with no need for further income can still take on a project with genuinely difficult constraints rather than an easy one. The constraint doesn't need to be real scarcity imposed by circumstance, it can be chosen scarcity imposed by decision, and the research on flow and challenge suggests the nervous system responds to chosen difficulty in largely the same way it responds to circumstantial difficulty, provided the difficulty is genuine and not merely performed. A third, easy to overlook, is simply noticing and resisting the adaptation as it happens in something close to real time, rather than only recognizing it in hindsight the way the man in the opening scene eventually will. This is closer to a Stoic exercise than a life-restructuring decision, a brief, regular practice of actually attending to an ordinary comfort before it's fully absorbed into invisibility, the hot water in a shower, a meal eaten without a screen in front of it, a bed slept in without any memory of a time sleeping was harder to come by. This doesn't reverse adaptation, which appears to be close to an involuntary biological process. But it does seem to slow the rate at which a person stops noticing what they have, which is, in its own quiet way, a form of resistance against exactly the numbness this entire script had been describing. The man in that house isn't broken, and neither are you, if any of this sounds uncomfortably familiar. His brain isn't malfunctioning. It's simply optimizing for exactly the variable it evolved to optimize for short-term safety, and it will keep doing that forever, quietly, running in the background of every decision he makes for the rest of his life unless something interrupts it on purpose. That interruption doesn't arrive on its own. Comfort never interrupts itself, it just gets more comfortable, in smaller and smaller increments, forever, the way a room slowly fills with a gas you stop noticing the smell of within minutes. The interruption has to be a choice made deliberately over and over, usually with no immediate reward attached to it at all, and often while every visible incentive in the man's life is quietly pulling him back toward the couch, the show, the version of tonight that requires nothing further from him. It's the hard conversation he's been avoiding for months because avoiding it feels so much easier than having it, right up until the avoidance itself becomes its own low-grade, permanent source of dread that costs more than the conversation ever would have. It's the goal with real risk built into it, the kind where failure is actually possible, not the safe goal he already knows he'll hit without really trying, the kind of goal Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily that he might not live to complete and pursued anyway. It's the discipline he keeps at with no reward except the quiet, private knowledge that he can keep a promise to himself, which turns out to be one of the only feelings comfort can never manufacture on its own, no matter how much of it he buys. Because his brain doesn't want him to suffer. That was never the danger, and nobody credible is arguing for suffering as a goal. But his brain doesn't want him strong. That strength requires risk, and risk is exactly what a threat detection system, running exactly as designed since long before there were houses or salaries or retirement to worry about, is built to minimize at every possible turn. It wants him safe. And safe and strong have never been the same thing. They never will be. The sooner a person makes peace with that, chooses the harder thing on purpose on a Tuesday, with nobody watching and no applause waiting on the other side of it, the sooner the static in that quiet living room finally has something to answer to.